Ready, Graham?
Thank you.
Pleasure now to introduce Graham Harvey from the Open University. Graham.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to say thank you to the organisers for inviting me and apologise for not being here yesterday. We had exam boards on, much less exciting, perhaps apocalyptic for some of our students. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really would like to have been involved in some of the longer discussions. So I want to take a shift to think about contemporary Indigenous peoples and the way that they are experiencing, engaging, responding to, confronting climate change in various places. My research has been among a variety of Indigenous people, and I will talk a little bit about that towards the end if I don't keep rambling. But I want to introduce a number of other people's work, a couple of Indigenous scholars and the way that they're thinking about the contemporary situations that they and their people are in. So my abstract begins by saying the world has already ended, and that's the flavour of the talk. So here are some historical illustrations from North America. This is not a metaphor, the world has already ended. The world for 90% of the population of Mexico pre the conquest ended. 90% of Mexican indigenous peoples were dead within a very few years of the first white person turning up, European turning up in Mexico. The deliberate slaughter of bison on the high plains is not only an act of ecocide, but also an act of genocide. And given that the human populations of the high plains understood themselves to be part of a larger than human community, the destruction of the buffalo herds, bison herds, was for them the end of the world. Everything they did was living with bison and other creatures. The other picture there on the bottom right corner is the smallpox blankets, deliberately introduced. So I was trying to find an image of North America. If you were to draw a map of the first European arriving, the disease line is 100 miles ahead of that. As the white folk crossed America, the disease line was 100 miles ahead of them already. So genocide, the end of the world, ecocide are not metaphors. The end of the world continues to happen. The Pacific sea level is rising so that there are now, sorry I've said this, I don't know if I got the exact figures, but many of the people of oceanic islands now live elsewhere than their homelands. The people of Kiribati, the Kiribati peoples, are migrating because Kiribati is disappearing. Many of the other oceanic islands will be gone in a few short years. And in the intervening period, the effects of climate change and severe weather effects is massively disrupting life for everybody, human and other than human, on those planets, on those islands. Maybe they are planets. So that's the unpleasant backdrop, the apocalypse in the sense of disaster already affecting people at the front line. So this is the first of the two Indigenous scholars I want to say just a little bit about. First is Larry Gross, an Anishinaabe scholar whose book Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being introduces and discusses the post-traumatic stress that his and other Indigenous people are struggling with, and to some degree the resources in their cultures, surviving cultures, experimenting, developing cultures, that deals with the survival of the genocide, of the ecocide, the massive or the end, I was going to say disruption, but the end of their cultures in many ways. But their refusal to take it as an end, their insistence that there are resources that they will deal with. So the Anishinaabe culture, in brief, one of the resources available to people there is seeing the world as a larger than human community. So there's a couple of pictures there of the maple syrup trees that in spring the people go out still to tap to gather maple syrup, and the child is there so I can tell you that, as Larry Gross explains, the children are told to be quiet in the forest because it's their home, and we are quiet in other people's homes. Now, nobody stops the kids from making noise. The second and third year they're told the same thing, and eventually they begin to get the idea of this is how you behave in somebody else's home, the home of the larger than human community. So the kids are still introduced to ways of being in the world which treat the world as an animistic, larger than human community. Somebody earlier said something about getting rid of personification. This is a nonsense. We can only talk about personification because we white-bearded male humans, think that white-bearded males are the only really important beings in the planet, and we talk about other beings in that way because we're personifying. This is nonsense. We talk about other beings as persons because they also act in family groups with desires, with passions, with fear, and so on and so on. That's what it means to be a person. It doesn't, white skin, bearded maleness is nothing to do with it. So, sorry, it was not in my script. So just drop the nonsense of personification. We're talking about persons in a larger than human world. So Larry Gross, I recommend to you saying some very exciting things about the resources of Anishinaabe and other Indigenous and other than Indigenous communities. So dealing with post-traumatic stress as a culture, not purely as individuals, finding in the culture resources for behaving in the world in different ways to those that are normally encouraged by the dominant European-derived culture. Then I want to say a little bit about Kyle White, who is a Potawatomi scholar of climate change, of environmental science, and so Kyle White's contribution to this apocalypse debate is to say we've already been through climate change. The Potawatomi were marched out of the forests of the US-Canadian border south to Oklahoma to an arid zone. They arrived shortly after the Cherokee and other eastern nations who'd been marched out of the eastern forests to the arid zones of Oklahoma, dying en route in massive numbers. I mean, the people who were marched were the survivors, the 10% of their people who'd survived the disease spread and the previous genocides. Those 10% and the recovering community were then marched to these arid zones. So they've been through climate change in a very literal, non-metaphorical sense, from forests, from wetlands, from agricultural and hunting communities, to a place where they knew very few, if any, of the plants and animals that then had to survive among, and with the aid of, the literal aid of giving up life to feed the humans who got there. So Kyle White's work is not only as a observer of global climate change and an historian of previous climate changes, but also somebody who goes to engage with tribal communities, indigenous communities across North America and beyond, helping those communities to find the resources for dealing with the current version of the end of the world, of apocalyptic climate change, trying to find ways in which those communities might deal with it, not by being backward-looking, imagining a romantic era of harmony with the earth, but of people dealing vitally now with a multi-species community. So that's Carl White's work, and Carl White is very present in the internet. Lots of exciting stuff that you can find, both solid science footnoted papers, but also his more interventionist blogging about ways of dealing with wild ricing and so on and so on. Okay, so I could talk about Carl White a lot more. Okay, so there's I'm now going to go backwards a bit. These are not just people talking to among their own communities. For example, the Choctaw Nation provided food during the Irish potato famine. When the English were still taking wheat out of Ireland, the Choctaw were sending food to Ireland so that people would eat. Of course, it wasn't enough, so more Irish people left. So there's a memorial in Middleton, and just this year there were communities, the Choctaw sent people to celebrate with people of Ireland, ways of engaging with that. And that's a pagan, so if we want to keep some nice themes and threads running through, the lady who isn't the Indigenous woman, she's the woman in black is an Indigenous Irish pagan. Not taking her clothes off at this point. Sorry, just challenging all the cliches here. Okay, and again, this is not about romanticism necessarily. I mean, nothing wrong with a bit of romanticism. Isidoro Lopez was assassinated earlier this year because he was at the forefront of dealing with the Tarahumara community in Mexico and their attempt to stop the destructive exploitation, extraction industries, destroying their forests and so on. So he's just one of the recent, only one of this year's people assassinated. So if you've been following I think Greenpeace and Survival and so on are foregrounding what's happening in Brazil at this moment. So the Brazilian indigenous communities are also at the forefront of challenging some of the things that are carrying on these destructive, genocide, leacocidal, apocalyptic events. Okay, so just briefly, because I have no idea how long I've been talking. Right, thanks. My own research, I've had the privilege recently of hanging out at an Indigenous festival in Arctic Norway, Sápmi, a Sami organised for annual festival in midsummer. So you can go next month, or is it, yes, July, still next month. In Arctic Norway, there's this amazing festival that brings together performers from around the planet, mostly around the Arctic and subarctic, but elsewhere too. It's in a fantastic valley, which in Norwegian is called Mandalen, next to Hagdale, so the man and the Hagdale together. I'm afraid I can't remember the Sami name, I apologise. That valley is formed by a couple of rivers. Now, the reason I put this up is not just to talk about the amazing things that happen in that festival. I could talk a lot more about that, but the river there is higher than it should be. This is a picture I took a couple of years ago. The river was almost overflowing the site of the festival. And it was overflowing because it was hot in the Arctic. That water had been ice probably 10 or 15 minutes before the picture you see there, the top of the mountains. The water was melting so quickly and the water was flowing through the mountain into the field. Now, climate change. I was having a conversation with a guy as I was looking at this water, worrying about how cold it was, wishing I could get into it. And he pointed out to me that the salmon and the trout were in the field waiting to come up river to spawn, but they couldn't, not only because the water was too cold, but also because the water flow was too much for them. And he said, this is a terrible disaster for the fish. And it wasn't primarily about the fishing, the resource that the Sami local coastal Sami people relied on. It was about the larger than human community being devastated by something clearly caused by humans. So that's the apocalypse in both the senses of disaster, of evolving climate change, but also apocalypse in terms sense of the revelation of resources that Indigenous people are bringing to this debate. Because they're on the front line, they're desperately impacted and affected, but they're also trying to say different things about the possible human responses and ways of engaging with this with climate change. This is one of those field pictures. I put it up purely so you've got something to look at whilst asking interesting and challenging questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. And we must talk later and swap stories.
Sorry?
We must talk later about, yeah. Questions? Justin?
Thank you, Graham. That was absolutely fascinating. And I suppose a question that sprung to my mind is, you talked about the resources that Indigenous peoples have, and I really appreciated the fact that you talked very concretely about the fact that they were living often post-apocalyptic world, that they'd experienced their world being destroyed. But I know it wasn't what you were talking about, but I wonder, from your experience, how, given the apocalypses that they had experienced were ones generated as a result of human agency, that these other people came and caused this mayhem to their world. Do they have a kind of a sort of, have you seen patterns in perhaps explanations of what had happened? Do they just put this down to people coming and not understanding the way the world really is? So these people didn't have a grasp of this larger than human world that we live in? Or is there a mythologizing of the apocalyptic experience for them? Or?
Yes.
I know asking you to generalise about all sorts of cultures, but
so I've heard a variety of explanations of what happened, and to me, one of the more consistent narratives is that Europeans had also been an indigenous, or a variety of indigenous communities that also lived within larger than human communities. And the only reason they could do the colonisation, the settler colonialism and so on, was because we'd first of all crushed our own indigeneity. So that provided a foundation for forgetting that we came from a place, and we left our ancestors behind and forgot them, and we forgot the plants that we lived off and among and so on. And we went off to collect others. So those stories, I mean, better told than that. And I've heard those kind of stories elsewhere. There are plenty of versions of the Europeans as the younger children, or the question of whether we're really human in the first place. So there's a classic anthropologist. Sorry, let's go back. When European people went to the Americas, there's a consistent Catholic attempt to find out whether the people in those places were human, and they did that by finding out if they had souls. Did they believe in something like a God? I mean, obviously there's a missionary effort there, but if they could believe in something like a deity, they were obviously more human than animal. So that was important, this interior life. There were some interesting other experiments by the indigenous people to find out if white people were human. The issue is not have they got a soul, but okay, you look like us except for the funny coloured skin, but are you some sort of weird, dangerous cannibal spirit? And you test that by putting them underwater and keeping them there for a while and seeing if they change into the dangerous, nasty spirit. So this is a Puerto Rican indigenous attempt to find out if Europeans were really human, with somewhat unpleasant effects on both sides, of course. And there are plenty of other stories about the cannibalism. If you read the Jesuit relations narratives in the conquest of New England and eastern Canada, they consistently kind of reveal that the indigenous peoples there are worried about these cannibal people who are basically greedy, taking, not sharing. And that's quite a common narrative too, that the cultures of the local indigenous cultures were about sharing, to the point that sometimes if you were a hunter, you were not allowed to eat the animal that you'd hunted. You would share it. White people had none of this decent etiquette. So those are kind of stories that I think illustrate, perhaps not, I mean, yeah, the ontology of humanity and white humanity.
Tristan and then Katerina. Then Ryan.
Thank you very much. Your starting point that we're already living, the apocalypse has already happened, we're living in a post-apocalyptic scenario. That's interesting. It's something I would say as well, that the apocalypse is uneven, but specifically it's geographical. Sure. I think it's about geography, isn't it? Certain cultures experience apocalypses. Daniel Boyarin, the famous Jewish scholar of the Holocaust, for example, says that Jews already lived through the apocalypse. We're living in a post-apocalyptic scenario. But I was also thinking, I remember reading Bill Cronin's Changes in the Land. I don't know if you've read this book. And part of that, he says, well, a lot of the Aboriginals in North America, specifically in modern eastern United States, would have created their own undoing had they had the technological tools to do so, and they would have been responsible for all sorts of extinctions. Oh. And I remember reading a Nature paper a few years ago that said 2 of the largest cities in the world happened to be, I think one was in New Mexico and one was somewhere else around there, and that these societies had basically collapsed in a kind of Jared Diamond sense. They had overused the resources around them and then had their own apocalypses in a sense. And so this isn't to pull away from the 100 million people that died in Teotihuacan in Mexico and things like this, but in some ways, and no way an apologist for the European colonists either, but there are these different apocalypses that happen throughout history, some of which are done on their own. Yes. And so I think sometimes that romanticism, and I know you said you weren't being romantic about it, about some Aboriginal cultures within North America, I think is sometimes misguided.
Sure, no, you're right. I mean, and that's part of that challenge to romanticism is to insist that these are not people living close to the earth by some inherent natural, unthought through thing. The Yucatan Peninsula is a classic example of the overexploitation of resources, that there's been a recovery because of the collapse of human populations. Those cities are still being revealed in Yucatan. And many of these other peoples, yes, there are examples of massive exploitation, but nothing like the overexploitation consequent to Columbus being found on a Caribbean beach. That was meant to be a joke. Columbus got discovered on a Caribbean beach. So yeah, no, I mean, we need those stories, and we need to understand that there is perhaps something not only human, but larger than human too. If somebody didn't tend this garden, it would very quickly probably become a birch forest, because birch trees are very good at exploiting any piece of land that they can get hold of. And they almost any species in the world wants the world to be more suitable for themselves alone. And one of the things that happens in Indigenous narratives and rituals is the insistence that not only humans are responsible for the way that we engage respectfully, but all creatures are. So if you want a really good piece of writing about environmentalism, ecofeminism was mentioned earlier, Val Plumwood's article, Being Prey, just go and read it. Crocodiles too are responsible for the way that the world works as a multi-species community. Val Plumwood knew that because she was attacked by a crocodile for being in the wrong place. It's a great article. We are not the top of the food chain. Crocodiles like to eat us, but they also police bad behaviour by other species. It's a great piece of writing. Val Plumwood, Being Prey.
Thank you. This was a great talk. I was wondering whether you can say a little bit more about, and obviously you mentioned a number of different people and culture and individuals also, how they see them, as I said, on specific examples, in relationship to the rest of the world. Because I'm sure, I mean, the Sami that you mentioned, or the North American indigenous scholars, I mean, they, of course, they know that they live in a world where
Sure.
their position is obviously sort of specific history of victimization, but also the majority will not change this worldview. I'm sure they're absolutely aware of this. Could you talk a little bit about some responses that they have and engaging with the majority culture? I'm sure they don't want to continue to see themselves as victims also.
No.
How does agency come in here?
Good, very good. So yes, so in part that's what happens at Ridu Ridu is very much, I mean, so again, you know, it should be obvious, if so far unstated, that these are people living in exactly the same world as us. They fly to the Arctic, they drive their cars, they do science, and so on and so on. They're not people trying to live as their ancestors lived. Absolutely, they're trying to draw on ancestral tradition, as somebody recently said, is a fire you tend, not a bunch of ashes that you venerate. Yeah. Good metaphor. So Ridu Ridu is one of those examples. I slipped and used the word survivance, which is another Anishinaabe scholar's complicated word for not just surviving, but trying to thrive and trying to say we are going to live well in this world. So Ridu Ridu is about celebrating Indigenous being in the world, and so trying to say, look, we're not going to get through this apocalypse, this disaster, just by being miserable about it. We've got to celebrate. So let's learn how to talk to the world. So in fact, that picture is of the strand where Niels Aslak, a Yoik chanter, used to live. So a Yoik is a chant. It could be sung from one human to another. It's a gift from one person to another. But those persons could be the mountains or the field, the reindeer or the salmon, and so on. So Yoik is the thing that many as Sami are trying to recover traditions about and to adapt into the contemporary world. So they become parts of Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish and Russian song traditions as well now, in which they want to encourage people to speak to the larger than human world, to try and have a conversation and to listen. You know, hugging trees and talking to trees is easy. The difficult bit is the listening. Yeah. So that's the bit that I think that they actually want us to learn is, never mind talking to trees. When are you going to learn to listen? And there are these kind of interesting resources that are there. So I think there are lots of these kind of indigenous and trans-indigenous, where lots of indigenous communities come together. So another short bit, because I know somebody else has got the microphone. Ridu Ridu one year, a Maori singer, Moana, and her band Moana and the Tribe, they began their set by saying, from our mountains to your mountains, from our rivers to your rivers. And that wasn't simply a geographical scenery recognition. This was about saying the mountains don't move that much, but humans who belong to the mountain and the river can bring greetings from that large in the human community. And maybe the whole audience, non-Maori audience at this point, is encouraged to sort of learn something and to try and see, is there some part of that we can adapt without being totally appropriative. Sorry, so that's a brief answer.
All right. I am someone who went to school in Oklahoma. I'm not originally from the area, and I'm not going to claim to speak on behalf of Native American groups in Oklahoma. But from my own experience, oftentimes I see Native Americans sort of frame what you consider to be apocalypse more of a process of continuing traumas. You have events like the Dakota Access Pipeline protesting and other things, where it's engaged on a much more human level in terms of political goals instead of more than human ones. Do you think you can speak about this for a little bit?
I can, but I suspect that that's partly dependent on the audience that they're addressing. Given that the pipeline people were talking about being water protectors, and if the media thought that meant we're protecting water so we can drink it, they've only got a very small part of the story. They were protecting the water so that the water could flow, because rivers deserve to flow from the mountain to the sea, and so the salmon can live in there, even if we don't eat them, even if they're creatures that we don't want to eat. So the narrative for people talking among themselves is often more than the narrative of the political thing. But these are very wise and savvy people who are going to say, okay, if this gets us a story, if we have to put on feathers to get on television, we'll do that. If we have to say this is about climate change, it's about protecting water so that it will flow to the next white town downstream, we'll do that. But what's happening in Ottawa today, in Canada 150, and so on, is not only about humans celebrating humanity, but that isn't to deny. I mean, sorry, I wasn't trying to undermine that, because of course humans protecting other humans is also important, because humans are not separate from that larger than human community. Humans are part of that multi-species world, and when we do disappear, the world will have to adjust, and the apocalypse will affect other species. So that narrative that we sometimes hear of, it'd be, that humans are a disease and it can be eradicated. That's not a typical narrative of most Indigenous people, and not even white people being a disease. We're all part of this community, and we've got to find better ways of living. Sorry, am I preaching now? Shouldn't be. Sorry.
Thank you, Graham. Some fascinating material in your presentation. Just a couple of remarks prompted really by the conversation you were having earlier with Justin when you said the word cannibals.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to respond. Perhaps a little bit more nuance about European attitudes to contact with Indigenous peoples in the Americas might be welcome in the early modern period, that there isn't a uniform response. So, for example, there is mass condemnation of Spanish atrocities in the New World by Bartolomé de las Casas.
Yes.
That's used by Protestants as propaganda against the Inquisition.
Yeah.
And particularly in your use of the word cannibals, if you want to respond. If you don't yet know it, my students love this text. Michel de Montaigne's essay on the cannibals, the first Western European to introduce the concept of cultural relativism. And it's something I urge you all to read as a way of thinking. So not all Europeans have a particularly triumphalist approach. Some are condemnatory, some are ambiguous, some are ambivalent, and that perhaps might be something that we want to think about as well, would be my point.
Yeah. No, in a 20-minute presentation, it's easy to skate over things and to come and to do the romantic stuff that I also want to challenge. So yes, I mean the European narrative practice and so on was not consistent in any way. You use the word slavery practiced by the British was not the same as slavery practiced by the Spanish, and so on and so on. These are all very different things, and the shorthand words we use can mask those massive differences. So, I mean, other than say, yes, I agree, and we need to hear those things more, I could launch into other stories, but I think probably... I mean, so thank you for the challenge, and you're right. There are those things. Nonetheless, the majority experience was that the European voices contesting whether it's slavery or the plantations were the minority voices, and they very rarely did much more than save a few people from the full horror. So, yeah.
Graham Harvey.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham.